Hi, everybody. We're here to talk about the administrations of Nixon, Ford, and Carter. So these are the things that they were actually doing while they were presidents. So we're dealing with Tennessee U.S. History Standards 99, 100, and 103. So we're going to analyze the Watergate scandal. We're going to look at the background of the break-in, the Supreme Court case, United States v. Nixon. We're going to look at the causes and outcomes of the energy crisis in the 70s. And we're going to look at the Camp David Accords, Panama Canal Treaty, the SALT treaties, and the Iran hostage crisis. All right, so President Nixon, he was the 37th president of the United States. He had this idea of what he called new federalism, which means he was going to decrease the size of the federal government. And you don't really decrease the size, you decrease their power. So he was going to give the government less power. He believed in something called revenue sharing, which meant that the local governments, when they were given federal money, they would be allowed to spend it however they wanted to, which doesn't always work out right? Then the people who are the ones making the decision end up helping themselves, and other people tend to get left out. Restoring law and order. Nixon ordered wiretaps on pretty much everybody. He said he was doing it to restore law and order, but what he was actually doing was he was using those wiretaps in the CIA to keep track of his political enemies. Okay. In 1973, you have the Yom Kippur War. Israel, Egypt, and Syria were all at war with each other. The U.S. is going to back Israel, and we are going to be sanctioned for that. The OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So where most of America got its oil from, which we used to make gas, okay? They announced an embargo on oil sent to the United States, which means they weren't going to send us any more oil. So we had to deal with whatever oil we had on our own, which means gas prices are going to quadruple during this time period. You're going to have gas shortages nationwide. Like this is the line just to get gas for your car. And they were probably going to run out before everybody got it. Okay. It is an insane thing. Big cities were hit the hardest. So gas shortages, people didn't know what they're doing. And this kind of points out that we don't need to be so dependent on foreign oil. Watergate Hotel. Okay, this is the Watergate scandal. 1972, there's a presidential campaign, and Nixon is running for re-election. And 5 members of the committee to re-elect the president, they did not think that through because the acronym was CREEP. Okay, so 5 members of CREEP broke into the Democratic National Committee offices, which were housed in the Watergate Hotel. Lots of big hotels do this. They let you that they also rent out office space. So they are going to be arrested for this break-in. Okay. And Nixon doesn't want news of this getting out because it could hurt him in the election. So he uses his influence as the president to cover up the crime. And that's where the problems for Nixon starts. Okay. Technically, he could have just let those 5 people be thrown in jail and let that be the scandal and let it go, and he would have been fine. But he uses his power of the presidency to cover up a crime so it doesn't hurt him, and that's illegal. Breaking the story. So 2 reporters from the Washington Post named Robert Woodward and Carl Bernstein, they get a phone call one day. And there is an unnamed informant. They nicknamed him Deep Throat because he talked in a very deep, throaty voice to kind of disguise who he was. We know today that he was one of the high-ranking members of the FBI. His name was Mark Felt. But that, it tells him, he tells them that this is what Nixon's doing to cover up this crime. So they do all the investigation, and they write an article, and the article blows up nationwide. People could not believe that Nixon would do this, and it leads to a congressional investigation. Okay. Now, the congressional hearings on Watergate are going to be televised. So American citizens, now this is after the election. Now, Nixon has already won re-election. This is going to be televised. People are going to be freaking out at watching this. Did our president really break the law? What's going on? Tennessee Senator Howard Baker really ask the pertinent question here was, what did the president know and when did he know it? And the congressional hearings find out that Nixon had been making secret recordings of all of his meetings and phone calls in his office. So there were the Nixon tapes that could literally answer that question. We could see what he was talking about and when he was talking about it. So Congress subpoenas those tapes, says, give me those tapes. And Nixon refuses. Okay. He says executive privilege. He says, we're talking about confidential information here and we can't give those out. Okay. And then he tries to end the investigation in what's called the Saturday Night Massacre, where all of the special investigators that were appointed by Congress to look into this matter, Nixon fires all of them. 9 people, just bam, they're all fired. And that doesn't make him look guilty at all, y'all. Of course it does, right? If you fire the people who are investigating you, yes, you look guilty. It goes to the Supreme Court, okay, in the United States v. Nixon. And the Supreme Court says he cannot keep those tapes privileged. Those tapes have to go to Congress. So they go to Congress, and we find out that Nixon knew all of it the whole time. Nixon even knew about the break-ins, like while the break-ins were happening, y'all. So, okay. So all this is going on, and Nixon is facing the possibility of impeachment. Nixon absolutely would have been impeached for this. But Nixon does not want his political career to end. So instead of being impeached, because if you get impeached, they don't just kick you out of office. You are then ineligible to hold future office. So if you get impeached, you can never hold another government office. And Nixon was convinced that he could revive his political career. So he becomes the only president in American history to resign. Okay. Now, the vice president, Gerald Ford, takes over, but that is not the vice president that was put into office with Nixon. Nixon's original vice president had to resign before Watergate because the IRS and the FBI were about to get him on tax evasion. So he had to resign. So they moved Gerald Ford into the vice presidency. And then when Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford becomes president. So Gerald Ford is the only president in U.S. history that was not elected to any office. Okay. He's very quickly going to pardon Nixon. He says he pardons Nixon because he wants to save the country from the embarrassment of having a former president on trial. Nixon accepts that pardon. Now, here's the problem. When you accept a pardon, you're saying you were guilty, right? Yeah, I did it. I'm sorry. I won't do it again. That's what a pardon means. So Nixon accepts that pardon. Now, Ford's biggest problem is that our economy was taking a huge beating here. We had what's called stagflation, which means we had very high inflation and very high unemployment, which means prices were going up and more people weren't working. And that doesn't work together very well. So Ford's big program was called Whip Inflation Now, or WIN. And one of the first things he asked people to do was to cut back on oil and gas usage. If you use less oil and you use less gas, the demand goes down, so eventually the price will go down. Okay. After Ford, Jimmy Carter is going to be elected. He is an unknown peanut farmer from Georgia, and he actually gave up his peanut farm. He sold it whenever he became president because he said that a president should not have any outside businesses that might influence his decisions. So 1976, he gets elected. He's going to use the old-fashioned fireside chats type things to keep in touch with America. And he refused to play that insider game with Congress. He refused to do that political wheeling and dealing. No, he was a very, very honest man. To this day, he still works building houses for Habitat for Humanity. So he's, really cool guy. He believed the biggest crisis in America, believed the crisis was America's biggest issues at the time, which was our energy problems, especially with gas. So he creates the Department of Energy. to figure out how we can use maybe alternative sources of energy, or find a way to find different sources of oil, something so we're not so dependent on foreign oil. He also creates the National Energy Act, which is why the speed limit on most highways is 55. Okay, it passes a tax on gas guzzling cars. So if you do not have a gas efficient car, there's a special tax you have to pay whenever you buy it. And he also lowers the national speed limit to 55. Okay. And he does that because your car uses less gas at 55 miles an hour. Okay. So that is the most fuel efficient speed for cars. So that's why the speed limit is 55. He is also responsible for the Camp David Accords, which helped forge that peace between Israel and Egypt and stop that war. The peace ended the fuel shortage because OPEC lowered prices. OPEC started sending us oil again, and that oil allowed the prices to be lowered. Okay. In 1979, there was a revolution happening in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini established a religious state, which was very strict obedience to the Quran. So you're going to have very anti-Western feelings in Iran, which leads to the Iran hostage crisis. Armed Iran students stormed the U.S. embassy and seized it, and you had 52 Americans who worked in that embassy were held hostage for 444 days before they were released. And that is it.